Hello, welcome to another tutorial from BlenderCookie.com. My name is Tiago Nunes and I want to share with you some things that I learned while improving my photography skills. These are things that directly translate to 3D since of course we're working with cameras as well, even though they're virtual. And they have the potential to quickly improve your renders with very little effort. I'll be talking about very simple settings that are often just overlooked or never really fully understood, although they play a fairly important part in your scene setup. Now the first of these settings is focal length. Now, imagine you're working on this scene and you pretty much established that the framing that you want is this. You want your subject to, in this case Suzanne, to be pretty much in the center of the image with a little bit of headspace and just a little bit, pretty much the same space under her jaw. Now, you could have picked to get closer to your subject, you could have picked to be far away, but no, you chose this framing. Now your work is not over. You can still play with focal length and achieve a lot of different results. Now the best way to illustrate this is to actually position the camera at different distances from the subject, but keeping the same framing. So let's just do that. Let's duplicate this first camera, move it closer to Suzanne in this case, and let's just name it differently. Let's call it camera close. No, camera 1. Let's call the second one camera 2. And then the next one would be camera 3, but we'll get to that. So let's change our scene camera to camera 1. And as you can see, if you want to make the framing be the same as before, you're going to have to decrease the focal length, turning in the focal length into a wider angle, the camera into a wider angle lens. Now you can already see that the framing is pretty much the same. There we go. Let's just duplicate it once more, this time backwards, and if we change the name and then the scene camera to be this last one, you can see that we now have to zoom in, or in other words, increase our focal length to right over here. Now, you can already start noticing some differences. Basically, or more importantly, in the cones that are sitting slightly behind Suzanne. In a wider lens, these cones seem to be a lot further away. The view is distorted, you can barely see Suzanne's ears, and the cones seem to be a lot smaller than Suzanne, when in fact they might actually be taller. Let me see if I can get a nice view of that. There we go. They're pretty much the same size and height. Now, in the second camera, things are a little more even. This camera is a 35mm camera, and let me just confirm that exactly. It's a 35mm camera, which is considered a normal focal length. Normal in terms of it approximates pretty much how your eye sees things. Finally, the third camera, which is further away, and as such, to keep the same framing, had to be zoomed into almost 70mm. You lose all sense of perspective. Everything looks flat, the sizes are all pretty much the same, and it looks as though, also because of course we don't have any other indicators such as shadows and all those things, it looks as though the cones are pretty much sitting on the same plane as Suzanne. Now, of course, you understand that if we went further back and therefore increased our focal length, this difference would be even more noticeable. You'd have very flat things, a very flat Suzanne, with barely no distinction between this eyebrow and her forehead. And if we went to lower focal lengths, you would see even more distortion here. The cones would appear to be even more to the back than they appear right now, which is already pretty exaggerated since we're working with a 16mm lens, which is considered to be pretty wide. Now let's switch into a more realistic, so to speak, scene, something you could actually be working on. I have prepared a scene here with our friend Sintel, although she was having a bad hair day. Basically I used, you're going to get the files for this anyway, but I used from Blend Swap Sintel Light, of course, by Bandancy, and this landscape by BMF, beautiful landscape called Early Morning on a Country Road. Now, I've pre-rendered these since there's a lot going on with textures and subsurface scattering and whatnot, so I'll just load those images. Since I didn't want to take quality away, I'll just open those images. I had a camera at 18 millimeters, and here you can see it. I had, let me just, there we go, split the view. I had another camera at 50 millimeters, and you can already tell the difference. Again, I kept Sintel in pretty much the same framing. She's occupying pretty much the same space in both images. But here at 18 millimeters, you can see a lot of the background, you can see a lot of the sky, you can see to the sides. You have the sense of perspective, and you can tell that there is quite a distance actually between Sintel and the tree, although it's probably been exaggerated since you can see the tree is almost the same size as Sintel, or looks actually even a lot smaller than Sintel herself. So your eye knows that, okay, things are back there. Now, on the 50 millimeter perspective or focal length, this is not so much the case. You cannot see a lot of the tree now. A lot of it has been cut away. You cannot see much of the sky, and you start to lose some sense of perspective. Everything is looking a little bit more flat. Now, if I open the last image, which was the 200 millimeter, now this is completely different. Here the image is completely flat, you can barely see a tree anymore, and you're not really sure anymore how far from the tree Sintel actually is. Also, by looking at her, even though we're exactly on the same axis, and in terms of the camera normal, if you can say that, it even looks on the 18 millimeter lens that Sintel is looking away from a camera, which she is actually, but here you're so zoomed out and so much further away. I can show you the 3D view again, where the 200 millimeter camera is, right here. There we go. It's all the way back here at 200 millimeters. So it is so far away, and the background is so compressed that it even looks as though Sintel is looking directly into the camera. So based on these observations, you can already tell that the choice of focal length will be driven by artistic and functional decisions. Say, for example, here with Sintel in this landscape, if you were doing this project, you're probably trying to show not only Sintel, but the environment she was into. Whereas in this second picture, if you use, for example, depth of field and completely blew out the background, you were not so much focused in showing the background in as much as you were focused on showing Sintel herself in a full body shot. Say, for example, you were renting a car instead of Sintel. Maybe you had a lot of work with the car and a lot of detail going on, and you weren't really worried about doing a detailed background. You could use this technique to actually show your car, show it, although it would probably get really flat if you went all the way up to 200 millimeters, so you probably want to pick something a little bit more tame, such as, I don't know, 85, 90 millimeter lens. But you could still compress the background. If you use depth of field, you could blow it out a little bit more so that your car would pop, and so you would get the main focal point, which would be your car, to be the only thing that your eye gets drawn to. If, however, you not only went into the detail of creating the car, but also created a nice environment for it, for example, a garage or like a pit in a racetrack, you would probably want to show all that as well, all the work you put into that. So you would probably go with a wider angle lens, maybe even as wide as 18 millimeters or more, and show not only the car but all the environment, and probably you wouldn't use such a strong depth of field either, so that you could still see the car surrounded by its environment. It's called an environmental portrait, where you want to show the subject in its natural habitat, so to speak. Now, I have a second set of images that I want to show you that warn you about problems that can happen when you use more extreme values both on the lower end of the scale and the higher end of the scale. So I took a headshot of Sintel, and I was really mean to her this time. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. This one at 18mm, and as you can see we got really close to Sintel here. And I did the same, but with a 200mm shot. Now, look at that. Of course, everything we've talked about so far still applies. You can still see a lot of the background here on the wider angle lens. And on the tight zoom, you can barely see any background. In fact, if you had depth of field here, this would be completely blown out. But we'll talk about that later. Now, the problem is in terms of flatness or distortion. Right here in your focal length, in your wide angle lens, you've really distorted Sintel's face. She's not really being flattered by this image. You've got a really pointy nose, and you know everything funnels from that. You can barely see her ears, and you know it's not really flattering. In this one, it's not that flattering either. So her ears are popping out. She would not be happy with this. She's pretty much flat as well, and again, you don't get the sense of perspective that you get from here or from a lower angle. Now, what this tells you is that if you want to show a model in a way that your eye would normally see it, you'll probably want to stick to a range between maybe 35mm to 70, maybe go all the way up to 80, but that's already pushing into a tighter zoom. And that's all I had to say about focal length. I hope this helps you. And from here on, I would like to talk about depth of field. Now for depth of field, I have another file because mainly I want to use the Cycles render engine. I've got Sintel back here. Now her hair is cut, or actually grew back. I don't even know anymore. And I want to talk to you about depth of field. Now, you surely already know about depth of field. Let me just render this. There we go. Am I using GPU? Yeah, I am. Okay. So if we choose, oh, hang on a second. I have not focused on Sintel yet. So always remember to set your limits on and then setting your focal point to your subject. And now going back to rendered shading viewport, you can see something that you probably already know, which is the aperture value influences the depth of field. So if you use a lower aperture value, you get a really blown out background. If you use a higher aperture value such as f16, you get much sharper, more in focus background. Now, actually, first of all, I use the f-stop value for messing with aperture. I don't really use the radius because it's not really intuitive. Basically, nobody takes a ruler to measure the aperture radius in their camera. People use f-stops. Now, all you need to know is that f-stops usually range from as low as 1.2, that's pretty much the lowest I've ever seen in a real camera, and then it goes up as much as it can. 16 is pretty much standard. Then some cameras, I believe, can go all the way up to 32 or probably even more. I'm not sure, but you know, it goes high. Once you get above 16, pretty much everything is in focus anyway, unless something else comes into play, but more about that later on. Now, as I said, you probably already know that aperture influences your depth of field. The thing is, it's not the only thing that influences depth of field. Now, let's make a really quick experiment. I'm going to take this aperture value and I'm going to set it at 5.6, and I'm not going to touch it. What I am going to do, however, I'm going to switch back to solid view, and I'm going to bring the camera really close to Sintel. So I'll hit G and double tap Z and get a real tight headshot of Sintel, Did I say Suzanne? I'm sorry, Sintel. Now, I'm really close to Sintel. I need to redefine the focal point right here. And you can tell we went from 3 meters, we went from being 3 meters away from Sintel to being half a meter away from Sintel. We're still using the same focal length of 60 millimeters, and we're still using the same aperture value of 5.6. Watch what happens when I render this. There you go. The background is blown out. Now, again, we did not touch the aperture. So this tells you that the distance to your subject influences the depth of field. And this is really important. Another thing that influences the depth of field is actually focal length. So I'm going back to solid view, and I'm going to undo this translation that we did of the camera. We're going back to our first camera. And by the way, let me just show you that rendering this at f5.6, you can still see some of the leaves, you can tell them apart, you can see a lot of tonal variation back here, and previously at just half a meter away from Sintel, the background was just completely blown out. So again, that did have a lot of influence. Now what I'm going to do this time, instead of moving the camera forward, I'm going to keep it at 3 meters away, same aperture, but I'm going to increase the focal length. I'm going to increase it all the way, say, to 200. Look at that. No way you can tell leaves apart from each other. They're just blobs back here. Everything is completely blown out. So that tells you it's not only aperture that influences depth of field. It's aperture, distance to your subject, and your focal length. And now I'm going to say something that you'll probably want to forget, which is there's actually a fourth element that comes into play when calculating depth of field, which is the sensor size on the camera. Now, apparently Blender Cycles was not doing this until very recently. There was a hard-coded value for the calculation of the depth of field when it got to the size of the sensor. But you only really need to know about this when you're trying to match your CG to a backplate or to live footage. So your camera has a sensor which has a specific size, which is important when calculating the depth of field. So that's why Blender has all these presets. So if you know your camera model but you don't know your sensor size, you can just select your camera if it's on this list, or you can go online to find out about it and input it here. And it does influence the depth of field. But again, forget that. You don't really need that most of the time. What you need to know is aperture, focal length, and distance to your subject do play a big part. Now, cycles being mostly how do you say, physically based, it does all the work for you. So you've seen that we've set the aperture value, and we've set the distance, and we've set the focal length, and cycles automatically calculated how much depth of field there should be, and it is realistic. But say you are working with Blender Internal, where you actually tweak the depth of field by raising or lowering a value in the compositor. If you don't know that these things influence it, you are likely to commit some errors when you're trying to define how much of a depth of field, how narrow your depth of field you want to have. So the next time, after seeing this, the next time you're working on your depth of field inside Blender Internal, you will know that you have to make a decision based on your distance to the subject, on your focal length that you're using, and on the aperture that you want to emulate. So you're going to ask yourself, okay, how far am I from my subject? I'm close. Okay, so if I'm close, I'm going to have to blow out the background, like as if I'm taking a macro picture of an insect. I'm really close to it, so my background is going to completely blow out. Or I'm far, so imagine I'm taking a landscape shot. My focal length is going to be wide, so that alone is going to make my depth of field be pretty high. Everything is going to be pretty much in focus. That, together with the fact that we are pretty far from our subject, imagine we're at the top of a mountain shooting at a valley, the aperture, the distance is going to be huge, the angle is going to be big as well, so that gives you pretty much everything in focus. Even if you put your aperture value at, say, 1.8, you're actually going to have most things in focus because those two other factors are playing towards a wide or a very big depth of field. Now, in cycles, you can also get artistic, mainly by using an f-stop value that is unrealistically low. For example, if you use 0.1, you get this. Now, this might be what you're going for, but at least make an informed decision, which now you can. Now, this is unrealistically low. There is no camera in the world, I believe, unless in some academic field, that can produce this sort of aperture ring size. We're talking about something that's really wide, and if there is such a camera commercially, it's going to be incredibly expensive. Now, even if this is real, and it is, I personally have a camera that goes up to 100 millimeters focal length at an aperture of 2.8, which pretty much blows out the background just the same way as it is blowing out right here. Even if this is real, you've got to be careful. Right here, my subject is a human, so my brain quickly associates it with other humans I've seen throughout the rest of my life, which have been a few, and knows pretty much how big Sintel should be. Now, if you were taking a picture of an object, even if you were taking a picture of a car, which we know pretty well how big it looks, if you don't have any other elements on the scene to provide you with a sense of scale, say other humans or a tree like we had back here, you run the risk of ruining the sense of scale of your scene, basically meaning you make your car, for example, look like a toy, like a really small miniature, because you're making the depth of field so shallow. Basically, your brain interprets it this way. Okay, I'm looking at something, the eye cannot see anything else, the background is completely blown out, therefore I must be really close to it. If I'm really close to it and this is a picture, then, well, it must be miniature, it must be a macro photography, where it's not. So be careful when using aperture values that are low, when you have not a lot to give you, not much else to give you a sense of scale. By the way, I forgot to tell you, let me bring this back so you can see it. The background I'm using here is just an HDRI image that I got from Googling, or I didn't Google it, but you can Google Sybil Smart Image-Based Lighting, and you'll get to this site, HDR Labs. They have a lot of HDR maps that you can use. They are licensed Creative Commons as well. We'll probably not include this in the files for the tutorial, since it is quite a big image file, but you can always go there and get it yourself, and you can actually get a different one since it's just for illustration. Okay, now that is pretty much all I had to say about depth of field, and my last subject is about the importance of post-processing. Now I'm going to zoom back a little bit again. Let me hit my camera and let's go to 120 millimeters. There we go. And let's use an f-stop of f12. Okay, now I'm going to let this render instead of just these samples because I want to bring it into the compositor. Now, post-processing is really important. Just as in professional photography, where photographers rarely use their JPEG images unless they need really quick turnaround times of just snapping the photo and sending it straight away to the editor, like sports photographers do. Professional photographers usually use the RAW files instead of the JPEG files that come out of the camera. And that's because they want full control over how the final image will look. If you just take the JPEG out of the camera, you can still tweak it, but you don't have nearly the same range of motion that you would get with a RAW file. So basically you're giving away control to the camera. You're saying, okay, I took this picture, but you decide how saturated it is or how contrasty it is. Now photographers don't do that. They take the RAW file, take it into the computer, and decide how saturated they want it to be instead of how saturated the camera thought it should be. Now it's the same, exactly the same in 3D. If you just take the image that comes out of the render engine, you're giving away a lot of control. You're saying, okay, I modeled this, I textured it, I lit it, I'm fed up with it, so you just pick the colors. Well, of course you chose the colors and all that, but what you get out of the render engine is just his interpretation of how they should look. You can always tweak them, and you should. Now, I'm not going to go into details in terms of post-processing. There are a lot more tutorials about that out there already, and even more if you search for regular post-processing tutorials in terms of photography and then apply that knowledge to Blender. But I am going to show you just a couple simple things that you can always do, just not to let that basic render be all you've got. So for example, you could adjust the contrast, and one way to do that is adjusting the Rgb curves. So this is the rendered image we had, and the way you apply contrast, or you tweak the contrast using Rgb curves, is using what is called an S-curve. So you bring the darks darker, the lights lighter, and you get a lot more contrast than you had originally. Now this may be a little bit too much. Maybe this is more something you'd like. Now another thing you could do, for example, would be to color correct the image. You could do it by using the color balance node. Say you wanted to make the image a little bit warmer, like giving it an autumn feel. You could make the shadows a little bit more purplish, but not as much as that, not nearly. You can make the midtones a bit more orangey. There you go. You can make the highlights more towards yellows, yellowish green maybe. Maybe that's too much. Anyway, this is just an illustration so you can see what I'm getting at. It is really important to post-process your image. It basically says, I'm not letting the renderer take control over my image. Take control, man. And you can see the difference, basically from what came out of the render engine and just a couple of tweaks, something that is more personal, more how you want it to look. And that's it. That's what I wanted to leave you guys with. I hope this has been useful, and I'll see you soon.